fact, you're here. Hello. How are you today? Good. I was wondering if you like fairies as much as I do. I'm a big fan, and I've got this book here called The Solstice Fairy, which was written by Loreley Amiti, that's me, and illustrated by Simone Stanghini. But before we start, I need you to do some magic with me. Can you do that? Can you please take your magic finger, close your eyes, focus, and when I say 3, can you point at the screen and shout, Abracadabra? But you have to really focus. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Abracadabra! It was December, the darkest season of the year. The cold sea wind was blowing through the narrow streets of the small town, and the strong smell of seaweed seemed to be everywhere. Tim was standing in front of a little cafe at the seaside, waiting for his mum. They had wanted to go into the small, cosy cafe, but Mum couldn't find her handbag, so she had rushed back to the car. She had been losing lots of things recently, mostly her keys. For weeks, Tim, Mum and Dad had been crawling under sofas, checking cupboards and shelves, even the fridge, and bins, looking for her things. The cafe looked so inviting, Tim couldn't help but stare longingly into the window. Suddenly, he noticed something. A little light seemed to be fluttering behind his back. Then it disappeared. There it was again! Quickly, Tim took a big step into the small corner under the fire escape. The light was gone. Wait! There it was again! The light seemed to be playing with him as it slowly lured him away from the cafe. Suddenly it stopped. It had stopped right in front of Tim. Surprised, he rubbed his eyes and took a closer look at the brightly flickering light. It was a little fairy. She was dressed warmly with a muffler and a fluffy woolly hat, not like the fairies in his picture books at all. She looked like a child too, just like Tim. So it's true, you are special, she cheered. Can you really see me? Yes, of course I can, Tim replied. Why wouldn't I? The fairy clapped her hands with excitement. I always knew you were special, but you are even more special than I thought, she said, beaming. Now Tim was even more confused than before. He didn't feel special at all. Why? What's so special about me? Don't you know? The fairy asked smilingly. You are among those very, very few children who can actually see us. I have a favour to ask, though, I'm afraid, the fairy said. I am so very cold. We fairies don't glow naturally, you see. We only glow when we have enough energy to do our work. But I haven't found enough light lately to charge my batteries, and my light has started to flicker already. How can I help you? Tim asked. Find me more lights, the fairy said. This is the darkest season of the year, and people don't use a lot of light anymore. But at the same time, they want fairies like me to work even harder. What do they want you to do? Tim asked. The fairy burst into laughter. Haven't you noticed recently? Missing keys, missing glasses, missing cutlery. How do you know about all that? The little fairy seemed impatient now. Because I'm your mum's fairy, of course. Everyone has got a little helper fairy to find things. But your mum isn't even looking at lights anymore to charge me up. She's just rushing around all the time. I know, Tim said sadly, but I don't think she'll stop just because I ask her to. This is why I've come to you, Tim. You have to find as many lights as you can and tell me where they are, please. I need them to charge my batteries before the winter solstice. Otherwise I won't be able to help your mum anymore. Can you do that? Of course, Tim said. Suddenly he was pulled away from the fire escape. It was his mum. Goodness, Tim, she cried. "I was so worried. I only went back to the car for a few minutes, and when I came back you were gone." Before Tim could explain anything, she took his hand and pulled him back to the car park. Mum hadn't found a handbag, so they couldn't go to the cosy cafe. On the way back home, Tim didn't speak much. He looked for lights. The little fairy was right. Not many people had lit up their houses or gardens. Some homes looked lovely, though. He had to remember the addresses. When they got home, he had memorized 6 illuminated houses and 5 pretty gardens for the fairy. He rushed into his bedroom and wrote it all down in a special notebook. It was only 1 week until the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. Tim was now busy, just like Mum and Dad. Instead of being at home and feeling lonely after school, he used his bus pass to travel all around town and beyond. His little book of lights, as he called it, filled up very quickly. It made Tim smile every time he looked at it. More and more things seemed to disappear, though, and Mum and Dad argued a lot. On the evening before the winter solstice, Tim was waiting outside for his mum to come home from work. When Mum pulled up onto the driveway, he quickly got up and jumped into the car. "Mum, let's drive to the beach, please," he said in a determined voice. "I've got pocket money from Granny, and I'd like to take you to that cafe at the beach that we wanted to go to the other week." Mum looked very touched, so they drove to the cosy little cafe at the beach. When Mum went to the counter to order, Tim quietly crept outside and went to the little corner near the fire escape. "Little fairy," he whispered. He didn't even know her name. "Mum's fairy, please, I have something important for you. Hello." Nobody answered. No little light came in sight. "Fairy, hello." Where was the fairy? Suddenly, he noticed a small, hardly visible something on the floor. Tim took a closer look. It was the fairy. She was blue and her eyes were closed. Trembling, Tim picked her up and blew some warm breath on her. Much to his relief, the little fairy started to move and showed a faint smile. "You came," she said. "I'm so cold." "I know," said Tim, "but I will take care of you now." Tim knew exactly what to do. Quickly he returned to the cafe and got one of the candles from the counter. When his mum was distracted, he put the little fairy right next to the candle. Nobody else but him could see her anyway. Suddenly, the lady from the counter came over with Mum's handbag in her hand. "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Simmons? I recognize you from the picture on the driving license in here." Smiling, she pointed at Mum's handbag. "I found this on our doorstep." Tim insisted on paying for Mum's coffee, but Mum bought him an extra big hot chocolate and an ice cream too. Tim ate as slowly as he could to give the fairy more time to warm up and charge a little on the candlelight. She smiled from ear to ear as she read through his little book of lights. When they drove home, Mum was humming a happy tune. Things would be good now, and Tim would make sure they always had enough lights in the house for all the fairies. "That was a lovely evening," Mum said. "Thank you, Tim." I hope you enjoyed the story, and if you're going to bed, have a lovely night, and I hope you dream of fairies. If you still have some time ahead of you, maybe you can write a letter to the fairies, or draw a picture of a fairy and send it to me. I would love to see what you're up to and what you're doing. Bye-bye. Be safe.